Good morning, everyone in the gallery. Nice to see you all. Welcome to staff. I hope this is a happy New Year day for you today. We will do our very best, and thank you very much for all the work that you've already done on the budget and submitting it to us. We appreciate it. Appreciate all the work everyone's done. So I'd like to call to order this special council meeting to discuss the budget. Is there any declaration of interest from any councillor? Okay, seeing none, I'd just like to go through the process of how this is going to work. First of all, in a minute, I'm going to ask each councillor if they'd like to make a general statement about the budget. After that, we have several motions to consider. And then department heads will be making their presentation of their budget to us, and we've had a chance to read that in advance. They may wish to speak to it, and I'd ask them to come forward to the microphone when it's their turn. For councillors, rather than going through the chair to ask your questions, of course, press your button. I will recognize you, but I will allow you to have a direct conversation with the person at the microphone. Just makes so much more sense than me intervening each time. Plan to take a break at 10:30 or close to it. When there's a natural break, we'll have a 15-minute break there. Everybody can clear their heads and prepare for the second section before lunchtime. So I would like to start just by inviting councillors to make any statements they'd like. And Councillor Wallace-Richmond, if you'd like to start.
Thanks, Your Worship. First of all, I'd like to thank the work of staff. It's important to recognize that this isn't something that's happening just today. It's been going on literally for months. And it is some of the most important work we do here. I know as a councillor, I'm never asked to reduce services, and I'm never asked to increase taxes. And yet that's the two leverage items or methods we have on a day like today. And it is not possible to cut expenses and increase revenue at the same time. So we have to make some big choices today. And if you've read the documentation, you know that we are facing a challenge as our first budget of this council in a growing city. I think there are two things we need to keep in mind. One of them is some of these expenses are required of us. We don't really have a choice. And the other thing is some of these are improvements that we need to make as a growing community. I also will be mindful of the opportunity costs of decisions that might not get made today. And so my questions and my comments will be around sometimes there's a cost to doing something, but sometimes there's also a cost to not doing it. So I look forward to the day. I know we have a lot of respect between us, and we have to make some tough decisions, and I look forward to all of your feedback, and I am extremely grateful for the preparation that's gone on so far. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Councillor Wallace-Richmond. Councillor Flynn, can I ask you to go next?
Thank you.
One more time, sorry.
Cut me off before I started. Might be a good thing. Thank you for the opportunity to make some comments. First, I will say I didn't declare any conflict of interest, but I will likely end up stepping out on one or two specific referrals. Probably, most likely for sure, the ASCU's deliberation on possible moving of the bus stop and things like that. So I will step out for that one, and if I see any one of them leaning towards something with to do with one of my clients, I will step out.
Yes, and please just announce, and same for all other councillors. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. And I do hope we have an opportunity during this process to go in camera to discuss a couple of issues as well.
Yes, and so if you feel a need for that, you could make the suggestion and we would move in camera.
Okay. So first thing I will say is that we had quite a long break this year, just the way Christmas fell, and I have to say that going through this very difficult budget wasn't exactly a great way to spend the break. But in 14 opportunities to spend this wonderful day dealing with a budget, this is probably going to be the most difficult of all of them I've dealt with. None of them are easy. Councillor Wallace-Richmond really spoke to the challenge. Service levels, people never want them decreased, and yet people don't want taxes to go up. And I think at this table we work really hard on that balance. And this year, like many, and I'm not going to pre-make excuses, but even more so than other years, there's significant decisions by other levels of government that are impacting this budget. And the most obvious one is the employer health tax. We were already paying our employees MSP to the tune of about $70,000. The provincial government has brought in an employer health tax. Just to be clear, they did not eliminate MSP premiums like promised, they just moved them to employers. And that impact on the city's budget this year is $158,000 approximately. We're not saving $70,000 this year, we will next year, if I'm correct in understanding the legislation, but people are just working through that. But this year there's a double payment, so that employer health tax on its own is a 1% tax increase in the math that we've got here. I might not have it interpreted exactly correctly, but that's a significant impact. Second thing is the federal government changing 1/3 of our income to taxable. We did a significant review of compensation for councillors and compared to other municipalities, and I think we had a fair compensation, but 1/3 of it was tax-free. Unfortunately, that change is going to be discussed in this budget so that we as councillors are whole in what we take home, but there's no question it's impacting the taxpayers. And finally, the one that we hear every year, and again, I'm not trying to make an excuse, but it's proposed that policing costs are going to be up $227,000 this year. That's not easy for us to control. We're going to talk about different options. But when you add up those numbers, we're at probably $430,000 of costs that are uncontrollable. We've got significant pressures on transportation, snow removal, all of those things. So I guess in summary, it's going to be an interesting day, and I'm sure you're all going to have fun watching us deliberate and discuss. So thank you to staff. Great job. I wish it was minus 4.88 where we're starting, but here we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Flynn. Councillor Lindgren.
Do I have to do anything to turn the mic? No, it's on. Thanks to the staff for the work that they've done to prepare, and I think my fellow councillors have summed up the difficulty of how we find that balance to be able to fund what we need to fund and not put undue pressure on the taxpayers. So I'm just interested in seeing how this all unfolds today, being my first one. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Lindgren. Councillor Cannon.
Thank you, Your Worship. I did spend a lot of the Christmas break looking over this budget. Thank you for all the work that staff did do in preparing it. I would have to say with this budget reflecting a 4.88% tax increase is probably the hardest budget I've ever had to look through and deal with. And as Councillor Flynn said, there's lots of costs in there that as the day goes ahead that we'll be discussing. And there's, I mean, within the budget, there's also some other things in there that aren't in specific referrals and aren't in the budget, and one being a motion that I'll be supporting and hopefully, or I'll be making, and hopefully staff will be supporting, or council will be supporting me. For the Recreation Society, we want to be able to hire and increase the operating hours up there. So that's something that's in our budget, but it's not in the figures. So I look forward to the day, and it's going to be a tough one. Thank you, Your Worship.
Great. Thank you, Councillor Cannon. Councillor Lavery.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor Harrison. Again, thank you to staff, as others have said. And I think that while we have a pretty tough task ahead of us here, I think it probably pales to the efforts and the decision-making that staff has had to make about what to present to us. And I think there are a lot of, and it's really important to recognize there are a lot of significant important proposals that didn't even make it through the cutting process to get to here. So I certainly concur with this being a difficult one. The budget memo that we received, and it was online, certainly, in my view, illustrated infrastructure needs that we're facing in the next while. We're not the only local government to be facing those, but they are significant in drinking water, wastewater. And I would argue, and I think it's reflected a little bit in this budget proposal here too, the issue of drainage and stormwater. And with the impact of climate change, significant rain events, the challenge for us in the next couple of years is to get our head around stormwater and how to manage that given the impact. So to my mind, we see some reflection of that in this budget. I don't think we see enough, and I think it's a further discussion for us and hopefully at a retreat down the line. As others have indicated, the RCMP budget, the snow budget, the employer health tax represents, in my calculations, 3.08% of the 4.88% proposal coming in front of us. We have no choice in these. This is, we just have to do them. And I would also note, and I think I do that each year, that the cost of living, the CPI index, in Canada it's 2.3% cost of living inflation. In BC, November to November, it's 2.6%. So here we've got a situation where already the cost of living in the CPI in BC is higher than the remaining gap that we're trying to make in this 4.88% proposal. And I'd further add that while the city is subject to ICBC and gas costs and gasoline costs and things like that, rate increases, our basket of goods is even higher than the home basket of goods on CPI because we're not buying bread and cheese and milk. We are buying professional services, construction materials, and equipment. And there's been a lot of, there's no accurate number, but the municipal price index is at least 1.5% higher than the CPI. And so when I look at this budget and this budget proposal at 4.88%, take out the 3.08% of that we have no control over, we are actually, this is almost a falling behind budget. And I view this proposal as a needs proposal. I do not see much fat in this at all. I'm somewhat concerned about the implications of that given the inflationary factors. I'm on the whole, and I think it's important to this table here to at least signify the lens that I'm applying to this budget here right now, and that is that on the whole, I'm accepting one or two little areas that I'll chime in on, but accepting the staff proposal as something that we actually need to do. And then on top of that, there are some specific referrals as well that are going to add on. In the last week, walking the dog, pondering around, going through the binder again and again, I have to really straightforward here. My lens is at about a 5.5% increase to make this work in a reasonable way that we maximize our delivery of services. This is something in the last 4 years that I've been here, we have been the last 2 years below the cost CPI. The year or two before that, we've been slightly above. But these are a confluence here that, especially again, given the RCMP budget, the snow and the employer health tax, we have little room to wiggle. I think we do need to spend a bit more. And so that's just, Your Worship, I just wanted to, the lens that I'll be applying here will be that lens and perhaps a titch higher than the staff proposal in front of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Lavery. Councillor Eliason.
Thanks everyone for coming. This is always a fun day. Not to repeat what anyone has said, but thanks to staff for all your hard work in making this go easier. My first budgets, I think we would come in at 15 or 20% and let us do the chopping. And I think by you guys eliminating some of those things, it makes it a lot easier and much more manageable in the upfront. I asked staff to prepare me a similar report to what Councillor Lavery has done, but we did it much more quickly. We haven't had our biggest tax increase in the past 10 years is 2.96%. In 2011, our tax increase was 0%. And so when the city felt that we needed to keep taxes low, which was after the economic crisis of 2008, we reacted and we were able to do that. 2013 is 1.48, 2014 is 1.38, 2015 is 1.9. We had 1.58 in 2017, 1.53 in 2018. So if you look at a 2% inflation rate or a CPI or a 3% or whatever you look at, we've been under taxing or underspending. And that's been recognized by even the CFIB, which is probably our favorite reports to ever reference, and probably the last time you'll ever hear it from me. But we've been in the top 10, top 12, top 21 in British Columbia for municipal spending and municipal taxes. Sometimes that catches up with you, and sometimes those things are outside of your control. And I think this is the budget that will reflect it. And so, is this going to be our toughest budget? Maybe if we were spending a bunch of money that was frivolous, but these aren't costs we can avoid. And so what Councillor Wallace-Richmond said is, do we cut services or do we increase taxes? Just in order to maintain the status quo, it's a over 4% budget. That's with nothing new. That's no new spending. So that's a zero tax increase for our police, our services, our wages, our snow, all of the things we need to do. So will it be difficult? Maybe politically it'll be difficult, but realistically it'll be pretty much business as usual for the budget process. So I wish you all luck today in getting what you want, and hope it doesn't hurt too much when you don't get what you want, because I know that's going to happen. I'm going to lose some 6 months today. So have fun.
Thank you, Councillor Lyson, and thank you to all of council. It's obvious that you're well prepared and you've thought out your positions and looked very closely at the budget. So I would remind council that presently the 4.88% tax increase would mean for a residential house in Salmon Arm with a $400,000 assessment. Our average is just below that. That would mean a $78 tax increase. For a business of a $500,000 assessment, the budget, the way it's presented, would be a $278 tax increase for the year. And I think that you're quite right. Many of these suggestions in this budget are very difficult and are givens. I would ask you to consider, where we can, phasing increases over 2 years rather than funding fully from this difficult 2019 budget. I would also ask, and I know that you will, look for revenues where we can, rather than just expenditures. And also, I think it is worth considering looking at percentages of funding from reserves in some cases. And I know that's a difficult one to do, but this is a difficult budget. So I would ask that you consider those options as we work through the budget today. So I'm not sure if the Chief Financial Officer would like to say anything before we start. If not, I will introduce the bylaws.
Thank you, Your Worship. So as you've already mentioned, the budget's proposing a 4.88% increase and a 2% new growth factor. This results in $19.70 per 100,000 of assessed value. Historically, the city's new growth factor has been fairly strong and has assisted in providing funding for new services and initiatives. Actual new growth estimate for last year, 2018, was 2.15. So the budget does also propose a 1.5% increase in water and user fees, which was approved in November. There's no change to the water and sewer frontage taxes, solid waste and recycling levy, or the transportation parcel tax. However, staff is reviewing the transportation parcel tax and will bring forward a recommendation in the spring. An increase to the parcel tax will not have an impact on the tax rate. As previously mentioned, the largest contributing factors to the increase are the employer health tax, police force costs, and snow removal. In 2019, the city will be responsible for a 1.95% employer health tax. This is on employment income and taxable benefits. This is in addition to the MSP premiums, as Councillor Flynn had mentioned. The policing costs, E-Division budget projects an increase of $133,243, and that have indicated that it's largely attributed to increases in wages regarding ongoing contract negotiations, training, fuel, and divisional administrative costs related to health services and special leave. More detail regarding the police budget costs will be discussed later during the departmental review. The ice and snow removal budget reflects an increase of $154,000. This was supplemented in 2018 by a transfer from reserve of $245,000. Given the reserve balance is now sitting at approximately $87,000, we need to increase the budget allocation this year. So unless there's any further comments of council, I would suggest we move into the departmental reviews.
Great, thank you very much, and really appreciate the work, Chelsea, that you and Tracy and your department have done in preparing the budget for us. I know that's been a huge job for you. So we will start with the introduction of bylaws. Council may notice that we are introducing the bylaw both for remuneration expenses and the technology allowance. And we dealt with those at council, but I made an error in that we split the bylaw into two and voted on it then as one bylaw, which you are not permitted to do. So that's why we're seeing it here again. This time we're looking at it in two different bylaws, because I know that not all councillors were supportive of both, but wanted to support one. So that's why you see it before you today. So item number 4.1, City of Salmon Arm Council Members Remuneration and Expense Amendment Bylaw, number 4295, first, second, and third reading. I need a motion from the floor if someone would like to make that motion. Thank you, Councillor Eliason, seconded by Councillor Flynn. Would I have staff just briefly review that for us, please?
Sorry. Thank you, Your Worship. So this bylaw is to give 3 readings to adopt an increase to council remuneration in regards to the elimination of the 1/3 non-taxable allowance elimination. So essentially it is an increase to pay to make councillors and mayor whole after tax.
Great, thank you very much. And we have had it reviewed before, and I know everyone understands it in detail. I will open up for discussion or questions by council. I see no speakers. I will ask the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? Councillor Lindgren opposed. The motion passes. We'll go to item 4.2, City of Salmon Arm Council Members Remuneration Expense Amendment Bylaw 4926, Technology Allowance, first, second, and third reading. I would need a motion from the floor. Councillor Wallace-Richmond, second. Councillor Lindgren, thank you. I would ask staff just to briefly review that for us.
Your Worship, this bylaw is to increase the technology allowance from $1,000 to $2,500 for each councillor and mayor to purchase an electronic device to view the agenda. It is an amount per term.
Great, thank you. And I know what goes along with that is that paper agendas, which are expensive and bulky to produce, do not have to be produced for those councillors wishing to take advantage of this. Is there any discussion or questions by council? Seeing none, I will call the question. All those in favor? That passes unanimously. Thank you. In the introduction of bylaw number 3, we introduced the bylaw to the budget prior to discussing it. There'll be amendments throughout, and then at the end we will vote on it. So is there someone who would like to move the City of Salmon Arm budget? Thank you, Councillor Eliason. Second, Councillor Lavery. We will then move into discussion of the budget, and we'll do it by department. And as is the history here, We generally start with the fire department. And so I would ask Chief Shirley, and if his deputy would like to come with him, please come forward. and
Your
present.
worship, our intent was to have the chief financial officer provide departmental comments at the beginning of each one,
Okay,
with the directors then responding to questions.
all right, so I won't put Chief Shirley on the spot quite yet. All right, so what you would like is for Chief Financial Officer to introduce each budget, and then the
Yes.
department head will come forward. Sounds fair to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Worship. The fire services budget reflects a net increase of $87,700. This is largely attributed to increasing costs due to several pieces of new equipment that were added to the fleet in 2018, as well as wage increases with respect to city staff and the firefighting force. The budget includes a transfer to the fire apparatus reserve of $185,000. This reserve is still significantly underfunded, and it's recommended that this transfer should be at least $204,000. Otherwise, the fire chief can answer any other questions council may have.
Great, please come forward, Chief Shirley.
Thank you, Your Worship.
Do you have anything that you'd like to add before we ask you questions?
No, I think similar to what Chelsea has said, very little new spending, pretty much status quo. The fire fleet is somewhat lower. Some of the apparatus are seeing a decrease in maintenance costs, a fewer increase. The new ATV units, for example, we have them both budgeted for a winch and a windshield. The paid-on-call firefighter payroll is also increased. That's from a 2017 resolution of council for that increase. And although the administration wage does show an increase, that's from the 2018 amended budget where we had some staff changes.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Eliason, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Your Worship. And the major expenditure here is the emergency equipment replacement fund. And it looks like our reserve in that will be about $1 million at the end of the year. We've recently purchased, but the lifespan on an emergency vehicle, again, Your Worship, is, what's the insurance allow us, 20?
25 years is the maximum.
Is the maximum. And
Correct.
so we need to prepare for a few trucks that will be coming up for that.
The next large we have next year administration vehicle, which is $70,000 or $80,000, and then in 2021 our aerial ladder has to be replaced, and it's today's cost is about 1.2 million.
Okay, so we don't have a lot of options once that's even if we do $200,000 this year, and $200,000 will be depleting that reserve right shortly. So it looks like we have to do that.
Okay, thank you, and appreciate those questions. What I'll ask council to do too is if they just refer to the page they're talking about, that'll help everybody out, I think. Do other people have questions for the fire chief? Okay, I have just a few. On page 37, and if we reference the page numbers at the bottom of those, under revenues, I see that we do recover monies from the Adams Lake Indian Band, 30,000, and the Sconlith Indian Band, 11,500, and also Called Hill Fire Suppression, 7,500. Those amounts, how are those determined?
I'm not entirely sure. Chelsea might have that information. I know historically they were an amount that I guess was approved by council a number of years ago, and they've been fairly consistent throughout the years.
Okay. Is Chief Financial Officer, do you know the history of that?
Yes, they're based on assessment values. So typically with the budget, we base it on the prior year with a change in April when we do the amended budget. So the municipal services agreement with those areas, the calculation of those revenues are based on the assessed values.
Okay, so there may be opportunity for those revenues to be increased once the assessed values are determined in April.
That's correct.
Okay, because I did notice that they're the same as in 218, and so All right, that's good information to know. Chief, you also talked about, on page 44, I know that we have some new all-terrain vehicles, and so the monies, the operating monies, 2,800, 46.5, are to ensure that those vehicles are looked after. Is that right?
That's correct. And that does include the addition, as I said, a winch on each one and a windshield.
Okay, thank you. I'd also want to ask under reserves, so I'm looking at the first yellow page now at the front of the binder, and Councillor Eliason did refer to this, and this may be also for the Chief Financial Officer. So fire department buildings and equipment, we're transferring in 25,000 into reserve, and the fire emergency apparatus, we're transferring 185,000 from general revenues into reserve. Do I understand that correctly? Okay. So my question is can we phase that 185,000? What would be the reasons not to do that?
I would say we're 1.6 million deficient in the reserve as it is now. So I would suggest not phasing it in, given how underfunded we are.
Okay, so if we did decrease that input, then when it comes time to purchase the next piece of fire apparatus, we would not have enough money to do it.
That's right.
That's in layman's terms? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Thank you. I will accept that. Councillor Flynn.
Thank you, Worship. Your questions led to me realizing there was a couple questions I wanted to ask. So with regards to that recovery, because I thought that was a really good question, when was that calculation or that discussion finalized as to how we would charge? Because I know in a lot of our funding agreements with, say, economic development and Roots and Blues and others, that there's been built in now an inflation factor. What year did we come up with the numbers that we recover from those organizations, and have we reviewed that in light of all the inflation issues?
I believe the municipal servicing agreement has been in place for quite a number of years, and it had a lengthy term. I would have to get back to you on when that is due to expire.
Okay, so I don't know if I need that today, but clearly, perhaps for next budget, we should figure out when that's up and should it be renegotiated and all of those things. And then, just so I understand, because we've got 50,000, obviously everything we can do to try to take things away from being out of general revenue to reserves when realistic. We've got less requests than normal, Chief, so thank you. But we're taking 50,000 from general revenue, and then we're putting 200 and some into reserve. Are those smaller items not designed to come out of the reserves? I mean, it's 6 in one, half a dozen in the other if you have that flexibility, but you're recommending that 50,000 on page 47 come from general revenue and upgrade the reserve allocation.
The reserve allocation of 185,000 is specific for the fleet.
Big
kind
stuff.
Of, yeah.
Okay.
Typically, we've spent approximately 50,000 of general revenue on smaller capital improvements in this department, and I believe the building and equipment fire reserve fund was more meant for major maintenance, larger capital expenditures required to the firehouses and things like that.
Okay, so simple answer to me is we need to do both and don't try to cut here. Got it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Eliason.
Yeah, thanks for a second opportunity and good questions. I need to I guess, lobby on behalf of the fire department is that we have a paid-on-call fire department here, which saves us millions and millions of dollars per year. When you look at emergency services being police and fire, in a place like Revelstoke, which is smaller than us but has full-time paid firefighters, their police or their fire budget is much more difficult to manage than this one. So, and I looked through the numbers, and in the next 10 years, we have at least 3 major trucks that will need to be replaced. And that's like the police budget increase for wages. That's outside of our control because that's an insurance thing. So I don't see very many things we can cut here.
Okay, thank you. I just have one other, well, perhaps 2 other questions. One is, on page 39, the clerical wages and benefits, it's only an increase of 11.3. I just want to know, is that directly just agreement related, or are there increased hours of clerical?
Go ahead, Chelsea.
Just agreement related, no increase in hours.
Okay, thank you. And I want to go back to what Councillor Flynn had suggested, or I don't know if he'd suggested it, but he talked about it. First of all, I certainly understand what Councillor Eliason is saying, and we are very grateful to have an on-call, such a large on-call fire department. So we are transferring in 25,000 into the fire department buildings and equipment. We're also spending 50,000 of general revenue on equipment, and so we are going to be looking for money as we do this budget. None of these decisions are going to be easy. My suggestion would be that, and I would make a motion or suggest a motion, that we not transfer in the 25,000 into reserve for fire department buildings and equipment this year. Is there a seconder for that motion? Councillor Wallace-Richmond, thank you for the second. And the reason I'm making that suggestion is this is going to be a tough budget. This whole binder is going to be tough. And we've talked already about specific referrals, and I know that there's specific referrals that councillors are going to want to add on to the 4.8%. So I would like to start with that small, I guess, from my point of view, concession on part of the fire department. The fire department budget has always been very well looked after and managed. This year it is a 9% increase just because of equipment that have been purchased. So that would be my rationale for not putting the $25,000 into that budget. Any other discussion? Councillor Lassen.
More of a process question as far as how the budget goes, and not specific to the $25,000, but I know that if we were to take the $25,000 out of the reserve transfer this year, it won't show up as something that we've spent in next year's budget. Do you see what I'm saying? So it'll look like it's new spending again, or it'll be an additional increase next year.
I understand.
Do you see what I'm saying? So it'll look like it's a major jump up next year, and we know that this is an important expenditure because we like to build up the reserves so we can do that. How do we make note, or how do we mark that so that it is, perhaps if it is cut this year, that it is a one-time cut? Or who do we suggest?
Sure.
Because next year if we put in $50,000, we'll want to cut it to 25 because it'll look like a huge increase, and forgetting that we cut the 25 out this year, right?
I understand. What a suggestion would be, Councillor Lassen, is a very good point, because my suggestion is not to, over time, short that account. What we could do is we could, for the expenditures this year that are supposed to come from general revenue, the 50,000, we could put the 25 into the reserve account and have the expenditures, which are on page 47, 25,000 of that come from that reserve and 25,000 from general revenue.
I'd be more amenable to that, because the line items of how it's arranged and how it just affects us going forward. And I know that we're all really smart people, but sometimes I forget too. And so I'd like it to be sort of in our memories that we know that money is allocated there, and we know that money should go there.
Okay, well, I would accept that as a friendly amendment if my seconder would. Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Then I could support that coming from that reserve and in and out, just to keep the line item consistent for next year.
Thank you. Councillor Flynn?
Yeah, I support the motion, but I'm confused as to how we've changed it, because when I asked if any of the reserves could be used for the small purchases, it's a building reserve, I thought.
It says fire department buildings and equipment.
Okay, so can that reserve be used for those small purchases?
I believe it could. The intent of the reserve was for larger items, but if it's council's wish.
See, I mean, honestly, I understand what Councillor Eliason's saying, but we have one-time costs in this budget of well over $100,000, as I said in my intro. I'm pretty sure the fire chief and the chief financial officer are not going to forget that we didn't put the 25,000 into reserve, and they're going to remind us next year. So I'm not concerned. I know what we're doing. I think, I don't know how to say it nicely, but mixing it up is just more confusing. And I support the motion as it was, but I don't support it trying to mix it up.
Okay, thank you. I'll ask Councillor Lavery to speak, and then I'll let the fire chief let us know his thoughts. Councillor Lavery?
Yes, thanks, Mayor Harrison. Again, putting the lens that I'm bringing to this table here now, I think that I'll vote against this motion. I think that we have, to my perspective, judicious recommendations from staff on this. I would suggest that next year's budget is not going to be any easier, given the infrastructure things that we're facing. And I think, from my lens, these are reasonable requests, and I think that we need to bite the bullet now. So I'll be voting against that motion.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other councillors who wish to speak to this item? Okay, before we vote on the motion, I will ask the fire chief his thoughts and whether he has a preference if council wishes to either take 25,000 of this year's monies from the reserve or not.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yes, we won't forget to put that money back in next year. Obviously, we look at past year's budgets when we do up our new budgets. I might just add that, as Chelsea said, it's for that budget is for, that reserve is for major purchases, for fire hall repairs, roofs, and that type of thing. One large item that we do foresee coming in the next 2 or 3 years is the replacement of our self-contained breathing apparatus. We have about 50 sets within the department, and they're, you know, $8,000 or $9,000 a piece. So that's $500,000 purchase right there.
Okay, appreciate that. So your preference for council's voting on the motion would be to reduce the 25,000 into the reserve, and if council were to authorize that, you would remind us next year that we needed to put 50 in.
Absolutely.
Okay, I appreciate that, and well, Councillor Lavery could well be right about next year's budget. I do know that the employer health tax and RCMP contracts likely will not be to the same extent, but it's a fair enough comment. All right, I think we've discussed that enough. I will call a motion. All those in favor? Opposed? The motion fails. Thank you very much. We'll just see if there's any other discussion, any other questions for the fire chief. Okay, thank you so much. We will move along. Fire Training Center. Chief Financial Officer.
Your Worship, the Fire Training Center budget is consistent with the prior year. There's no significant items to note. There was a minor increase in office expenditures to purchase new whiteboards for the center. Otherwise, there's nothing to really note, and the fire chief can answer any other questions you may have.
Okay. I'd ask the fire chief to come forward again. I'm not sure there'll be questions, but there may be. Council, any questions regarding the Fire Training Center? Councillor Cannon.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just had a question about the revenue that you make from the center. Is it pretty much like a wash, like the revenue and the expenses? And is there opportunity to make more revenue with the fire training center?
Through your worship, initially when we started the center, there was a number of neighboring departments that didn't buy into the facility for the capital project, and since then they have. So although there's a few smaller departments that are outside our regional district that take part in training, the revenue side is very little, and it certainly doesn't look after the operational costs.
So further to that, is there opportunity to perhaps get it out there to make more revenue from the training center?
It's a possibility. We have initially, and it's been some 20 years since we started that project, and initially we looked at opening it up to, throughout the province basically. Since that time, most regional districts have done a very similar thing that we have done, and where they have one training facility within their regional district, and you see that throughout the province. So there's not much opportunity there. The other point to it is that we looked at others that were doing that, and they were finding that the cost for maintenance of equipment and replacement and having a staff member there to coordinate and look after it didn't really make it profitable for them.
Okay, thanks.
Councillor Flynn?
Thank you. Under the other funding on the revenue sources, similar to the question about fire service contribution from First Nations and that contract or agreement, the other funding from a regional district, has that been reviewed lately at the level of that? And is there a long-term agreement with COLA clauses in it, or is it set years ago and hasn't been changed?
The current agreement is due to expire in 2027.
Okay.
And it was recently done in 2007.
So it was a 20-year agreement. Did it have any increasing costs or anything?
The amounts are based again on assessment
Okay.
values. And every year we review that with when the roll comes out.
So as assessment goes up, but we didn't build into that. So unless there's inflation in assessment, we don't get any increased contribution.
Correct, unless there is provision for other areas to buy into if they're interested.
Okay, and then when those other areas use the facility, do they pay the same, or do they pay nothing?
No, there's a schedule, rate schedule for them that they pay.
So if they're not part of the other funding, they pay to use the facility?
Correct.
Okay, okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from council? Thank you, Chief. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, we'll move on to building services. Chief Financial Officer.
Your Worship, the building services budget reflects a net increase of $25,500 and is attributed to anticipated increases in building and plumbing permit revenues of approximately $23,000. Included in the capital budget is the purchase of a hybrid SUV. As discussed in my memo, the intent in 2019 is to purchase 2 hybrids, one of which will replace the Chevy Cobalt, which is currently utilized by building inspectors, and one which will replace a Public Works Jeep, which will be repurposed for the Capital Works Supervisor. It's proposed to fund the building department's hybrid by using $10,000 from the Civic Vehicle Reserve and $35,000 from the Climate Action Reserve due to the vehicle having a green component. And the Director of Planning and Development Services can answer any questions you may have.
Terrific. Do council have questions for the Director of Development Services? Councillor Lavery.
Actually, I have comments, not questions, so perhaps I'll just step in.
You go ahead with your comments and then it's fine.
So I'll refer to page 58 and the hybrid sports utility vehicle. My comments will be very similar to the other proposal for the SUV as well, and going from there. So I actually do have 1 or 2 questions to start off with, but an overall comment. For the last 2 or 3 years, so just to confirm, the $35,000 is proposed on this vehicle to come from Climate Action Reserve. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. So in the past 2 or 3 years, I've been urging council with that climate action funding, which is contingent annual funding of about $50,000 a year. And in the, don't want to take a lot of time here, but in the past, we have tended to save it up and invest it, spend it on bigger budget items and sort of take it down to zero again and to go from there. I have had in the past no qualms or quibbles about how we've invested that money because it's tended to be in the pool and the ice rink for big bang items. But for the last 2 or 3 years, I've been urging council to apply the lens of a third for this. Number one is don't drain the budget. Number two, in our conceptual thinking of this, think about a third of it for big bang items, think about a third of it for saving, and think about a third of it for more demonstrable projects that are, because the public doesn't see what we do with a replacement of lights at the rink or whatever else. So have about a third of that for more demonstrable, admittedly less bang for the buck in terms of GHG emissions, but to apply that lens. What I see here, the combination of this proposal and for the other SUV proposal, is essentially number one, draining the budget down to $2,000. And number two, I argued, and I think successfully, but council supported last year SUV vehicles, applying $10,000 to the difference between the cost of the vehicle, of a regular gas engine vehicle, and using the climate action funds to top it up $10,000 for the extra cost of the hybridness of the vehicle. And I think that, I mentioned before, I think that the proposals in this budget from staff, I am supporting across the board, and I support the idea of this, but I don't support the idea of draining that budget, especially when we've got other items that we'll talk about down the line. I think we need to preserve money in that budget for more demonstrable items, and I don't think that blowing most of it, investing most of it, spending most of it, maybe blowing is the wrong word, it's pejorative, is the way to go about it. I do have I'd like to hear others' thoughts on that, but I'm about to put a motion forward. I'll leave it up to you, Your Worship, about whether you want other discussion before I make it, but that we allocate for this vehicle $10,000 from the Climate Action Funds contingent on staff finding another source for the, I'd have to, for $25,000 from another source, and that it would revert back to climate action funding if that was not used in 2019.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Lavery. What I will do is I will allow you to ask staff about the other source, because I think the motion needs to specify what that other source would be, and it may be your responsibility to find the other source. So I will accept the motion, but I think it would be, I think what staff is saying to us is this is their suggestion. And if we have a different suggestion on how to fund it, then we need to include that in the motion, whether it's from general revenue or from a certain reserve account. Would you like to explore that with the Chief Financial Officer?
I can certainly follow that up with some questions as well. Does the vehicle qualify to be taken out of the equipment replacement reserve fund, which is projected to have $1.863 million by the end of 2019 in it?
No, it's not. The vehicles that are used by the building department, they have their own equipment replacement account, which is called the Civic vehicle. The reason for that is that we don't use those vehicles and don't charge an hourly rate wherein we recoup a portion of the capital and operating costs of their use. They're internally used only. So, and that's why they have a separate account. So we shouldn't be using the equipment replacement reserve to fund any vehicles used by that department.
Thank you. And I know the Civic vehicle one, there's some taken out and some being added in, but it would not be enough to cover that $25,000. At this stage, Your Worship, I think, this is, and I'm not sure if this is possible. I'm not, if there's a forced vote on this, I'll vote against this at this stage but I don't want to vote against it. What I want to do is be able to contribute $10,000 what I would like us to do is to contribute $10,000 from climate action. I don't know if perhaps after the break or if staff has an idea of another reserve fund that would come from. I do think the precedent last year of climate action contributing that top-up amount, and I get the problems that we're under here, but I do not want to drain that because I think there are other climate action ideas that are as demonstrable. So, Your Worship, well, I guess maybe to staff, just a follow-up question. Are there other reserve accounts that this can come from?
I would request that you identify which reserve account you'd like to use because all of the reserves have been earmarked for another specific purpose. So if it is of your wish to use those monies for this vehicle purchase, it would be preferable if you could identify which account to
My next
use.
follow-up question would be general fund surplus unappropriated is projected to have, I mean, we're taking money out of that, but almost $569,000 projected by the end of December 2019. Could 25K come out of that?
It could, but that is a contingency account as on a whole in the event that we experience any unexpected costs. That's kind of the only account to absorb them. So it could, but it would be my recommendation not to.
Okay, I'll accept that recommendation, and so, Your Worship, just for my 2 cents worth then, I will vote against this proposal that we have in front of us. And I would urge, if there is another solution, that staff can come back for us later on in the day or after the break, and because we do that at some point. I do want to see this happen. I do not want to drain those funds primarily, and I think in the introduction to this it is a component of it. It's not. I don't think climate action should take the full brunt of that reserve removal, and I have the same arguments, although a different reserve account for the other SUV. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Lavery. And if at break time you do get together with staff and identify something, for sure we could come back to that. And I think that's probably a really good opportunity for council to know that if we do plan on shifting money, we have to know where we're going to shift it to. It could be general revenue in your motion. So for any future ideas like that, I will be asking for which budget you would like the monies to come from. Councillor Eliason.
Yeah, thanks, Your Worship, and I'm doing my best to work through the book here, but how much are we expecting to receive in a climate action grant this year through you to staff?
Typically, we have received anywhere between $40,000 and $50,000 annually, but that amount's not known until we complete our year-end process around March. We would find out how much we'd be applying for.
Okay. And I agree with Councillor Lavery. Like I think that the approach that we should be taking to this, to these grants and to this money should be for us showing leadership within our community. And I think we should identify a project that does that. I think that people see our vehicles and our cars and out driving, and showing that they're hybrid is important. And I think that that's the right step forward, is that hybrid vehicle being driven by the city. People don't see the pipes and the heat exchangers and everything that we've done with it in the past. We've talked about putting solar panels on top of the gazebo that we're going to build for $65,000 in Blackburn Park this year, for solar lighting of the skateboard park, or for fields, or for that type of thing. I think demonstrating to the future generations that we're doing stuff will show the possibility of something like that. So if we can't find the money and we don't take the extra funds, and with an increase from general revenue, which would be a tax increase of $20,000 or $40,000 on this line, or $60,000, whatever it be in the line item, then I would suggest that we work as a council to refocus on Councillor Lavery's third process, which are demonstrable activities and projects for the city to show the leadership, because if somebody can do it, we can do it, and then they can do it, right? So I'd be interested in finding those funds for that, and if we don't, then I would definitely be supportive going forward to use those funds for those types of projects. And I think it's our responsibility to do that, to show leadership within our community. So people can take note of that.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Flynn.
Just looking at the page in front of us, do you want to revisit that first item? Happens to be $25,000. Just saying. Seriously, I understand what you're saying. I think we could find the 25,000, but that would just be robbing Peter to pay Paul. But my question is related to the reserves and the question that was just asked about how much typically goes back in. If this is a budget, why on the first yellow page with regards to balance in reserves is it not showing our anticipated budgeted money that's going to go back into that reserve? Because isn't that the whole purpose of the budgeting process? And if it's supposed to be 50,000, wouldn't that be a transfer in 2019 for next year?
We have never budgeted for the revenue from the climate action. Mostly because it is not a guarantee we get it. And so I did not include it.
Okay, so if it comes through, it would go back in that budget.
Correct.
So if what's happened the last 5 years or whatever happens, we'll be able to replenish it.
That's right. So if we do get the revenue, which hopefully we do, we would be up another 45,000. So closing, even with these transfers, we'd be sitting at about 47.
Okay, and I know where our fleet is at, but we're trying to do 2 vehicles in 2 different departments in the same year using the same funding mechanism, although one's coming from climate, or they're both coming from climate action, right? 35,000. No question, both of those vehicles are needed this year, and I'm kind of getting ahead. I know our fleet's in bad shape, but is there any way we could do one in 2019? And Band-Aid, duct tape, whatever, what we have. I'm not saying I want to do that. Rob's cowering in the corner.
So I appreciate that. I think we'll wait till we get to that transportation budget to talk about that particular one, if you're okay with that, Councillor Flynn, and that's a fair question once we get there.
Okay, so all I would ask is prioritizing which vehicle is more important. Here, staff can battle with each other.
Okay. Presently, both are in the budget.
Okay.
Okay, Councillor Lavery.
Yes, thanks, Mayor Harrison, for the second attempt at this. So I will work with staff and maybe at the break, and we've done this before in terms of coming back, but I'm going to talk about putting a little heat on here right now. I'm going to make a motion that we reject the staff proposal for the hybrid SUV as constituted, that we take it out.
Okay, is there a seconder to that motion? Councillor Flynn. Would you like to discuss that, Councillor Lavery?
I do. It's staking a position on this. I want to put a little bit of heat on all of us to find out a way to make this happen. But if in the next hour or 15 minutes or whatever, we don't find another way, that's still in the budget, and I'm against taking that climate action out. So I'd prefer to take the approach of remove it at this stage, and if we can find today some other way of getting it back in, that puts the pressure on all of us to do that.
Fair enough. Other speakers to that motion? I'll call the press that again, Councillor Lindgren. You have a defective button. Actually, yours comes on right away without me even. You have to press mic off. Ah, now press it. Aha. Councillor Lindgren.
Thanks. I just had a couple comments about, Chad talked about how this would be a leadership initiative that the public can see that we're driving the hybrid vehicle. So I think that that's an important thing. I think that perception guides a lot of what we do. So I was just surprised when I saw these numbers for the estimated fuel costs. I mean, buying the hybrid vehicle, I assume, is quite a bit more expensive than buying a non-hybrid. Yet the fuel cost savings are minimal. So this is strictly being seen as a green initiative, not as a cost-saving measure, I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong. So I had a couple questions about where we could get more money and whether or not we need, it's pretty obvious from this report that the cobalts are ineffective and they don't even seem to be very good on gas. They're lousy in the winter. They're not servicing us well. Can they both be sold? Can we buy the 2 new hybrid vehicles this year and then add a vehicle to the fleet next year that is obviously needed as well? So those would be my questions.
Okay, so as far as the operating costs of the hybrid vehicle, Councillor Lindgren's question is it more economical, I think, than the regular gas-powered vehicle?
Director of Engineering.
It's a very difficult question to answer. I think any vehicle that you have is going to be a cost. It appears to be a bit better on fuel economy, but as far as maintenance goes, we don't know what we're going to get. We have 2 in the fleet right now, and we have yet to see what's going to happen in the future with those. So really, we're trying to do something proactive with the hybrid vehicles, and from staff's perspective, I think it shows some leadership in the sense that we are trying to move something forward.
Thank you. Would you have any follow-up questions to that, Councillor Lindgren?
Just a comment that I agree that having a green initiative and taking leadership in that area is a good thing, but when we're only saving, say, $800 or $900 a year in fuel costs, it's obviously not being done for cost-saving measures because it's, we're saving all this money on fuel, so it's worth it, sort of thing. I agree that it's a good green initiative and we should continue to pursue it. So then I guess my other question is, can we get rid of both of the cobalts? Can we sell them and use that money towards deferring the cost of the new electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles?
Director of Engineering and Public Works.
The 2 cobalts, if we sold them, I don't think we get enough money to recoup to purchase another vehicle, and we do need another vehicle in the fleet. So the intent was to replace the 1 cobalt this year and replace one of the fleet vehicles at Public Works and retain the Jeep for our Capital Works supervisor, and then obviously next year replace the other cobalt. So we're just trying to phase it out, as Council had mentioned earlier.
Councillor Lindgren, does that answer your question?
Enough for now.
Okay, thank you. Any other discussion on the motion to remove the purchase of the hybrid vehicle from the budget? Councillor Flynn.
Just to clarify, the motion is to completely remove it?
At this time, yes.
This time, as opposed to not using the Climate Action Reserve?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Wallace Richmond.
Thanks, Your Worship. At this point, I'm leaning towards voting for the motion because it will give us time to figure out where else we can find that money. And also, there is a clean energy vehicle for BC rebates. I don't know if municipalities are eligible, but there's definitely a lot of opportunity around switching out from gas only to hybrid or electric. And perhaps we need to investigate that further. So, thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Eliason.
Yeah, thanks. I won't be voting for this motion. My question is, do we need the vehicle or not? I think we need the vehicle. This is and I appreciate the caginess of the motion to protect the climate action funds, but I think we need to find a different way to protect the funds. But we still need this vehicle. If we can find a different solution and coming forward, this isn't the be-all end-all of budget. We have at least a week or so to come up with those things before final reading. But at this time, I think we need the vehicle, and I think we need to find a different method to protect the climate action funds. So I won't be supporting this. Thank you.
Okay. I'll only entertain speakers who have not spoken twice on this particular motion. So, Councillor Flynn, you have spoken once.
Yes, thank you.
I will entertain your.
Thank you. And speaking to the motion a second time, it really is more a question, and Councillor Lyson may have answered it for me, but all kidding aside, I said we could find $25,000 in the previous motion. This isn't the final be-all and end-all procedurally. This is, we're going to look at everything and then we have a week to digest it and come back and tweak. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Okay. Then I will vote against the motion. I will leave it in the budget and hope that we can find a way to take some money from somewhere besides climate action if possible.
Okay. Councillor Lavery, I know you've spoken twice on this. All right.
I think this is the advantage of a good table discussion. I'm actually comfortable deferring this motion until the next week and that gives us actually, rather than 5 or 10 or 15 or 1 hour to work on this, we can bring this back up a week from now when we look at it again. So I would defer this motion.
All right, do we have a seconder for the deferral of the motion? Councillor Walsh Richmond. All those in favor of the deferral? All those opposed? It passes. Deferral passes. Thank you. Councillor Eliason?
Can you defer a motion in a budget meeting like this, or is it best to call that question and then work on it afterwards? Because if we're deferring it, don't we have to have a specific date for referral rather just than tabling the motion until later in the day?
I was wondering the same thing myself. Let's just check with the administrator. Administrator, is the deferred motion acceptable at the budget meeting, or should we, is it allowed, I guess is the question.
It is allowed, yes. I don't know that it gets us anywhere, though.
Okay, so the deferred motion passed, and so what that means is that the hybrid vehicle remains in with the budgeting the way it has been designed. Any other questions for building services? Okay, I have a few questions. So on page 56, under the revenue side, I just wanted to ask the Director of Development Services. I see the building permits increase in revenue from 320 to 340, and plumbing permits from 15 to 18. Could I just ask about the rationale for that increase?
Your Worship, we base the revenue on the projected building permit activity for next year, or this year, sorry, 2019, and we're estimating 45 million in construction value. And if you look at last year, we did 66.8 million, a record year in the city, 374 permits issued, with those two old vehicles driving our building inspectors around in. So we have a big surplus that can maybe help out with some vehicles, but that's all I'll say on that.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to ask the Director of, or Chief Financial Officer, what the actual 2018 building permit and plumbing permit revenues were.
I don't have those numbers on me right now, but I can definitely get them for you.
That's okay, because I have them. So the building permit revenues for 2018, the actuals were $515,756. The plumbing actuals were $29,144. So that total is $535,000. So we're projecting, and I understand this is a banner year, it's the best year we've ever had. We're projecting $358,000 for 2019. So the difference between those two is $177,000 in revenues, which is 33% less revenue. My feeling is we are going to have less revenue. I agree with that. But I don't think we're going to have 33% less revenues. And I understand the conservativeness of the department in coming up with the revenues. But in my view, we're being very conservative with revenues and realistic with expenditures. And so I would like to see an increase in that building permit revenue and plumbing permit revenue, not to this year's amounts, but I would like to see an increase. And to me, $380,000 in building permit revenues and $20,000 in plumbing revenues for a total of $400,000, I think is realistic. So would like to make that motion that we increase building permit revenues to $380,000, plumbing permit revenues to $20,000 for a total of 400,000, and then I'd open it up for discussion if there's a seconder. Second, Councillor Flynn, and I certainly will allow the director at the end to give his input as well. Councillor Flynn, would you like to discuss that?
Yes, I would.
Okay.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that forward, because we have this discussion pretty much every budget year, and I understand being conservative, but like you said, conservative on revenues and then totally realistic on expenditures. And I think I wouldn't call the budget amount conservative, I'd call it ultra conservative. But that being said, I can support the 400,000 and would suggest we may have found 25,000 for the vehicle. But I will vote in favor of the motion. It's easy to add money back in.
Okay. Discussion from other speakers. Councillor Lassen.
Yeah, I would like to, I'd like to see our building stats again, and I don't have those in front of me at the moment, but I got them. Can I get back to you? Like the 10-year building average and the revenue that we've, not the revenue that we've brought in, but just by the numbers. Because historically, if I know that I've briefly explained to most of you how we've seen the numbers go from a record year and down, and I just wanted to see the averages of those years and see what that average decrease is. Not saying that one is similar to the other, but in 04 we had a good year, 05 we had a good year, 06 year, 7 was our biggest, and then what the drop from 7 to 8 was, and then 8 to 9 was, just so that we're not managing those unrealistically.
Thank you, Director. That was impressive.
That was quick. I filibustered my way right onto that page there.
So as you can see, Councillor Lyson, the average is over 18 years. And that's part of my argument for increasing the revenues, and I'm sure part of the director's argument for not. Because I know building a house 18 years ago cost a fraction of the cost it costs to build it now, which would mean your building permit would be much more expensive now.
And my concern is if you look at the years I was talking about in 2005, 2000. Oh, can you scroll back up right there, just to the totals? So we went 47, 42, 66, 53, 24. And I'm not saying that we're going to see the 2008 market crash that we saw. But if we look at similarly, I would say, you know, at least the 10% to sort of drop, and that was relying on the institutional there for that number, right? So if we look similar 2017, 2018, and we look at a drop of, what was that, $12, $15 million, something like that, we relied on those larger institutional builds in those years. So as long as the increase that you're proposing is in line with that reduction, I think that's okay. So what's the number you're basing the 400 on?
So I would say $380,000 in building permits and $20,000 in plumbing permits for a total of $400,000.
And what numbers does that come into in millions of building?
So that is around 50,000 in very rough numbers.
Around 50 million?
50 million in rough numbers.
Okay. And we're going from 66. Yeah, I'd be comfortable with that. Thanks, everyone, for the info on it.
Okay, Councillor Flynn?
Yeah, sorry. I was just going to say, in my math, it's around 50 million because the director said 45 million would generate the 340. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So we're kind of saying, let's budget for a $15 million decrease, and I'm relatively comfortable with that. I do know that the housing market in major centers has somewhat crashed. So that could have an impact on us, and we do have a big institutional project in 2017 and a big commercial project in 2018. So I'm comfortable with using 50 million to generate the 400.
Okay, thank you. Any other councillor speakers? I would invite the Director of Development Services if he thinks the motion is okay or comments on it.
Your Worship, just looking I guess over the 18-year trend, I calculated we average about 250,000 a year in revenue over 18 years. And the annual operating expense of the building department has typically been around 300,000, just slightly over that in recent years. We have two building inspectors, a level 1 and a level 3. The level 1 building inspector is retiring. We hope to hire a level 2 in the near future. And yeah, the future is hard to tell. But you know, if we get 50 million next year, that would be nice.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I appreciate the discussions we have each year. Last year we had the discussion, we ended up at 320,000 in the budget as far as building permit revenues go. And we actually had 66 million in amount. And so we surpassed that by quite a bit. Just out of curiosity, what happens to the surplus? So this year our surplus was quite substantial.
So the budget allocation is directing those surplus funds towards the Affordable Housing Reserve and a portion to property acquisition. However, the full anticipated surplus wasn't realized, so the property acquisition has been rebudgeted this year.
Great, thank you very much. I think we have all the information we need. So the motion is to increase the total revenues to 400,000 from 358,000. I will call the question then if everyone's had a chance. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion passes with Councillor Lavery opposed. Thank you very much. We'll move on. I think we'll, would you like to take a break now, or do you want to do police protection first? Let's take a break. I think police protection might take a while. We'll take a 15-minute break till, if we can have the councillors back in their seat by just after 10:30. Okay, thank you. We'll take the, we'll start it.
Yeah.